Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about American culture, and today we are talking about the Second Great Awakening and Reform. So, if you are ready, let's begin. Now, the Second Great Awakening is a religious revival that spurs reforms in America, and it's mainly a Protestant revival. This is Protestantism, if you remember, is a branch of Christianity separate than Catholicism. They don't have the Pope. For example, like Puritans and Calvinists are Protestants. Okay. And if you remember, we've had a first great awakening in America, and this is the second great awakening. This is a follow up. It's very similar. So hopefully it's ringing a bell for you. So, what are the causes of the second great awakening? Why does it come up again? Well, one big thing is that in the early 1800s, right, we have the market revolution, which we've learned about. And the market revolution causes a lot of changes to society because of new transportation and new economic focus and new inventions that's going to make people a lot wealthier. They're going to be able to grow in their social mobility, and it's also going to make it easier for people to move around the country. And so all of these changing and shifting is going to cause people to think about their religious beliefs. Okay. And so some examples of how these religious beliefs kind of get spread is one of them is in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. Okay. These things called camp meetings that they have. And it's pictured here on the right. And these are basically large church gatherings that they would have, and they would spread their message. And as you can see, they were very, very popular, and a lot of people attended things like this. And then they would go home and they would spread that message to their families and to their friends, right? And an important preacher person to know, Charles G. Finney. He's a prominent preacher of the Second Great Awakening. That's if you need to use evidence on an LEQ or an SAQ or something, that's a good person to drop. Okay, so what is the message of the Second Great Awakening? Well, people need to accept God or Jesus into their lives. That seems consistent with the First Great Awakening. But remember, we have the Enlightenment that's going on and inspiring the American Revolution, right? And there's a lot of focus on science lately. And they are going to, in the Second Great Awakening, reject this idea of rationalism, of trying to make sense of everything. They're going to ignore predestination, which is a Calvinist idea where if you're born good or bad, okay, God already knows if you're going to heaven or hell. Okay, so they're going to reject these notions, and they're going to focus on that God's grace can be obtained through faith and good works. And these good works are going to spur a lot of reform movements. So, what are some of the impacts of the Second Great Awakening? Well, one important impact to know is the new branches of Christianity that get created. And probably the most important branch that gets created is the Mormons. Okay. And I'm sure you've heard of Mormons, they're still around today. Um, Joseph Smith was the original leader of the Mormons. He creates something called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And, he's got a long story, but eventually he's murdered in 1844, and a lot of his followers were persecuted. Okay, and Brigham Young takes all the rest of the Mormons to Utah in the middle 1840s. And maybe you've heard of Brigham Young University, right? And so when Brigham Young goes there, he sets up a community. It's prosperous. It spreads. They Mormons often go on missionary trips abroad to bring immigrants back and to convert people to Mormonism. And so Mormons become a big part of Utah, and that's actually what helps Utah become a state. But you need to know that they're persecuted, they're kind of forced to move to Utah, and they're a good example of how the Second Great Awakening spurs these new religious movements. Okay. Other impacts of the Second Great Awakening are that women are a big part of this. Women are recruited. Women spread this. Women are a big aspect of the Second Great Awakening. And that's going to again lead us into more moral and social reform movements that we're going to see soon. Okay, women are going to be often at the forefront of these movements. And the last kind of impact of the Second Great Awakening is that a lot of utopian societies get formed. Now, a utopian society is a society where they're trying to live by ideal values. Okay, one example to know is the Oneida community in New York. They believe in things like equality and free love, and that everyone needs to contribute equally to society. Okay, so again, I think of these. We talked last time about the transcendentalists, right? I think of utopians in this United Community often as like hippies to me. Okay, it kind of makes sense. So, as we said, the Second Great Awakening spurs a lot of reform movements because that's a central part of the impact of the Second Great Awakening. And so, what are these reform movements? And it's really important to know each one of these and be able to make some connections with some people. Okay. The temperance movement. This is a huge, huge movement in the middle 1800s and it goes all the way into the early 1900s. Okay. So, this is where they want to limit the use of alcohol. And this is often pushed by women who are getting that newfound respect during the Second Great Awakening. For example, the American Temperance Society gets created by Lyman Beecher, okay, and they get aligned with the abolitionist movement, and they're focusing again on trying to get people not to drink alcohol because they think it's causing a lot of problems in society. All right, and one example law, Maine actually passes a dry law in 1851. A dry law is a law that bans alcohol, and eventually, not in this unit, but we'll see the entire America bans alcohol in the early 1900s. All right, so another reform movement is education. Now, in the 1830s, we see a push for universal education, and this, again, falls back to ideas from the Enlightenment, the idea of a child becoming important and the focus of childhood. And so we want education to be universal for all. And there's a very important figure here pictured on the right. Horace Mann is called the father of education for America. He does a lot of work in advancing the role of public education. Okay, third reform movement, the asylum reform. Okay, and so asylum reform is about the treatment of mentally ill people, and this is often a big issue at the time where people who are mentally ill, we know mental illness is a big issue, today we talk about it, but back then, a lot of times what they would do is they would put these people in these asylums, and kind of society would forget about them. So Dorothea Dix is an important person to know, and she helps improve the treatment for people who are mentally ill. And again, we see another woman making reform movements, making change and progress in society. Okay. Last one to know about is prison reform. There is a lot of focus on making prisons more equitable, more fair for people, and eliminating the idea of going to prison if you're in debt, which we've seen all throughout US history caused a lot of rebellions, right? If we go back into early US history. So they're eliminating that as an idea. So make sure you know each one of the reform movements and connect a person to them or an idea. All right. So the last one of the last big reform movements, not the last one, is the abolition movement. Okay, and so this deserves its own slide because it is a huge topic, and we're not going to just talk about it today. We're going to talk about it in future lessons as well. So you need to know what abolition means. In this context, it means to end slavery. Okay, so this in the mid 1800s, early 1800s, which is this unit, is a small part of the population of the United States, but it's a significant part, and they're making noise. Okay, so some examples here. One important example is the American Colonization Society, which is founded in 1816. And their idea to try to end slavery is to free slaves, emancipate them, and then move them to a country that they're going to create in Africa called Liberia. All right. And so some big proponents of this are Henry Clay, John Marshall, Daniel Webster. We've heard of some of these names before. And so this is kind of, I think it's kind of a far out there idea, but this was a popular idea at the time to free the slaves, move them back to Africa, even though that might have been born in America. They might not even been from this part in Africa, but this is one of their ideas. Okay. Seems a little out there, but that's something that happened. Now, the abolition movement gets more success in the North, okay? Because it should make sense. The North is not as reliant upon slavery. They have a bigger population of free Black people than the South does, right? So, in the North, some people to know. One is William Lloyd Garrison. Now, he is a newspaper editor and he creates a newspaper called The Liberator, which is really important to know about. It spans about 30 years until we see the end of slavery at the end of the Civil War, and it's calling for an end to slavery. And they're publishing articles, getting people to pay attention and spreading these ideas. A lot of their stories, influence a lot of people. And an example of a person or a former slave who tries to continue the abolition movement is Frederick Douglass. Now, he was a former slave from Maryland. He's a great speaker. He's an abolitionist. He also advocates for women's rights. He's an amazing figure in U.S. history. He creates his own newspaper called the North Star. Right, so we see how he's spreading the ideas of abolition. He actually gets to speak with some of the presidents. He makes a big impact. Okay, another former slave, Sojourner Truth, is also doing the same kind of work. Right, and then with all this abolition movement going on, especially in the North, we need to understand that the South actually gets more entrenched in slavery. So what that means is they kind of dig their feet in. They're now saying, they used to say that slavery was a necessary evil. That was kind of the idea that, it's not a good thing, but it has to happen for our economies. These Africans can't take care of themselves. That was kind of their argument. And now they're going with a new argument in the mid 1800s, spread by John Calhoun, where slavery is actually a positive good, right? So they say, look, slavery is helpful for Africans. They can't take care of themselves. We're feeding them. We're giving them homes. We're clothing them, right? We're helping these Africans. That's the argument they go to. They call it a positive good. That term is AP likes this term, positive good, knowing that the South again switches their arguments about slavery and they kind of get entrenched and they get more stuck with their views on it. All right, so the last big topic for reform is the women's rights movement. And we've been talking about women a lot in this course, right? We've talked about Republican motherhood, we've talked about the cult of domesticity, and this is where we start to see now finally the trend for more growth in the women's rights movement, which will continue up until even like the 1960s, right? Depending on how you're looking at it. Now, the women's rights movement is aligned with the abolitionist movement. People who are activists for women's rights are also usually activists for abolition movement. It kind of goes with the territory, but usually the abolition movement overshadows the women's rights movement. Okay, so the women's rights movement has a hard time kind of getting their feet off the ground. They want to end this focus of Republican motherhood and cult of domesticity, where middle upper class women's focus is on educating women, or sorry, educating families and children and the moral values. They want to end that focus and they want women to be more equal in the political and economic spheres of life. And a really important event to know about, memorize this one for sure, the Seneca Falls Convention, which takes place in 1848. And this is a convention, is like a meeting, right? So this is a meeting of a bunch of people who want to see women's rights advanced. And they write something called the Declaration of Sentiments. Right, so that was actually a play on it. Should remind you of the Declaration of Independence, and they basically rewrite the Declaration of Independence to include women. Right, not all men are created equal. All men and women are created equal. Okay, they want to get women's right to vote. They want more equality. Some important people to know that are advocating for women's suffrage, which means women's right to vote: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and then our guy we saw, Frederick Douglass. Okay, so Seneca Falls Convention, really important to know. Okay, so that is it for our notes on the Second Great Awakening and Reform. These are what I'm trying to help you with, the big ideas to synthesize everything we learned about. So, what are the causes and effects of the Second Great Awakening? What are some of the reform movements going on in the mid 1800s? And try to make some connections to specifics, to people, to events. Okay. And lastly, describe the abolition and women's rights movements of the mid 1800s. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.